Well, a brand new patch for Arknights Endfield just dropped, and you know what that means? That's right, it is theory time! And we've got a surprising amount of material to work with. This patch put a lot of focus on some new concepts like the Feranmuts and the proxies, while also introducing us to Ardashir and Nefereth's motivations. Now granted, neither antagonist really said all that much as far as concrete information goes, but we at least have a vague idea of who they are now and what they're trying to do. And we also have a new faction to investigate, the Foundation. Now I looked long and hard for any traces or mention of the Foundation and the Exiles, and I came up empty-handed. And because I had no leads, I decided to shift gears and start investigating the Feranmuts and proxies instead. My logic was that if Feranmuts and proxies are getting the spotlight around the same time the Foundation is, then there must be some sort of relationship between them, however weak it may be. Plus, I knew there was a lot of information about Feranmuts and proxies in the original Arknights game. And while I didn't find a direct connection between the Feranmuts and the Foundation, the investigation did give me an idea about who or what the Administrator really is. Now, Nefereth and Ardashir seem to be allied with the Foundation, and they need Endmen in order to achieve their goals. So by working backwards through my investigations from the Feranmuts into the Administrator, I was able to sort of reverse engineer some information about the Foundation that is not present in-game. So we'll kick things off with an overview of the more established lore surrounding the Feranmuts from the original Arknights game, and this is very useful, especially if you still don't know what they are. And then we'll talk about some of Terra's relevant history before moving into the theory portion of this video, where we'll be talking about Originium and the Foundation. Now do keep in mind that while I will be including a lot of expository lore from both the original Arknights game and Endfield, this video is still a theory. Also, there will be spoilers for the original Arknights game. I am trying to give you this lore without context so that you are still surprised by the story beats in the game if you want to play it yourself, but just know that there will be some spoilers. So okay, with that disclaimer out of the way, let's get to the good stuff. And by that I mean Feranmut lore. So Feranmuts are a species of gigantic, long-lived, physically immortal, godlike, reality-bending entities that are found on Terra, the planet featured in the original Arknights game. Now, normally I would call them entities native to Terra, except for the fact that a Feranmut named Ya implies that their species came from space originally. But they were the first life forms to settle on Terra, and they claim responsibility for creating all the life that followed and terraforming the planet. And the reason they can claim that responsibility is because a Feranmut has the power to grant life to just about anything, even inanimate objects. And they also possess an entire internal ecosystem that's full of various life forms inside of their bodies, which is why they're sometimes called living arcs. Additionally, when their physical body dies, the result is a sort of whale fall, wherein their body becomes a part of the land and nurtures a fertile, localized ecosystem. So in death, they become the land. Although their connection to the land exists while they're alive as well, since each Feranmut claims a plot of land for themselves and draws power from it, which allows them to mature and grow. For this reason, Feranmuts consider their land to be an extension of their own body, so anything living on that land is considered to be living on their body. Now, in addition to all these life-related powers, each Feranmut possesses their own unique set of abilities, with many of them being able to bend the laws of physics to an absurd degree. But it's important to note that none of their abilities are derived from Originium, which does make sense when you think about it since they technically predate Originium's creation. It's also worth noting that they are impervious to the downsides of Originium too. For example, Feranmuts cannot contract oripathy or be downloaded into the Originium's assimilated universe, which is interesting to me because the assimilated universe functions as a sort of arc for humanity, a characteristic that is shared with the Feranmuts, but for different life forms. So I guess you can't really put one living arc inside of another arc. Now I know I called the Feranmuts immortal and then talked about them dying, but this is because only the physical form of the Feranmut can die. A Feranmut's soul or consciousness continues to exist even after the loss of their body, and it may even transcend into another realm or dimension. In these instances, or when a Feranmut enters a temporary death state, also known as hibernation, they can create proxies to interact with the material world in their stead. You can think of this proxy as a sort of humanoid incarnation or avatar that functions like an extension of the Feranmut they were born from, which also means that they possess the same types of powers as their Feranmut counterparts, although the state of those powers will vary quite a lot depending on both the circumstances of the proxy's creation and the current state of the main Feranmut form. For example, the Feranmut Ya is neither dead nor hibernating as far as we know, but they've still created a proxy to interact with humanity, which functions more like a second, smaller body than an independent entity. In contrast to Ya, the Feranmut Sui was sealed due to circumstances that we're not going to talk about today, and then fell into a prolonged forced hibernation. Over time, their residual consciousness fragmented into 12 pieces, each one manifesting as an independent incarnation, which resulted in Sui having 12 proxies. And each of these proxies has their own unique abilities, memories, and physical characteristics, meaning none of them consider themselves to actually be Sui the way that Ya's proxy is actually Ya. I hope that wasn't too confusing because that's basically everything you need to know about the Feranmuts at this time. So now that you know what Feranmuts are and what they're capable of, I'd like to give you a little bit of a history lesson about some stuff that happened on Terra so you can understand why they are relevant in my investigation into the Foundation. If you've played the original Arknights game, or if you've watched any introduction lore guide for Endfield, then you might recall that thousands of years ago, the humanoid precursor race arrived on Talos 2 while they were trying to escape the Observers. And in case you forgot, the Observers are this unseen cosmic entity that can delete anything that exists. Just click, boom, deleted. We don't know a whole lot about what the precursors got up to on Talos 2, but we do know that they made the Stargate that took them to Terra, which they treated like some sort of doomsday bunker research facility hybrid thing. You know, a place to hide from the Observers while they tried to come up with countermeasures for them. Now, by the time the precursors arrived on Terra, it was already home to the Feranmuts, which is important because, according to Ya, the Feranmut had once fought against an entity that sounds an awful lot like the Observers, and they won, although they did sustain heavy casualties. And this implies that Feranmuts have the capacity to fight against the Observers. They are a viable countermeasure. Now, I want to be very clear about something. Ya does not explicitly call this threat the Observers. They just call them an eye which broke the heavens. So my disclaimer is that I am making a fairly big assumption here, but it makes sense in the context of observation being tied to sight and observers being described as eyes sometimes. And because if this assumption is true, then it answers a few very big questions that I've had about the precursors' movements and eventual countermeasures taken against the Observers. For example, why did the precursors choose to hide on Terra instead of Talos 2? Because as far as I can tell, the Starpod sky barrier that hides Terra from observer detection could have been erected on Talos 2, and is, to some respect, currently erected on Talos 2 in some small areas. This leads me to believe that there must have been a much more important reason for their migration. And I think that reason was the Feranmuts. Because if Feranmuts did manage to fight the Observer threat, or they showed the smallest sign that they could combat them on somewhat even footing, then the Feranmuts would have been the perfect motivation for the Precursors' migration from Talos 2 to Terra. Feranmuts would have been a critical part of the Precursors' anti-observer research efforts. And they were, in fact, researching the Feranmuts. While on Talos 2, the precursors had already developed technology capable of modifying and leveraging a Feranmut's natural ability to use its body as a living ark. But that's not to say this was the start of the precursors' Feramund research, because there's evidence to suggest that the research predates even their arrival on Talos 2. See, the Rhodes Island landship was apparently a precursor spaceship that crash-landed on Terra once upon a time, and when it was discovered by later generations, it was initially mistaken as Feramut remains. And the idea of a Feramut being modified to be used as a spaceship isn't that crazy of an idea either. We've already established that Feramuts came from elsewhere in the cosmos, so it wouldn't be unheard of for the precursors to have been working with them prior to the Talos and Terra expeditions, but there are also instances where a Feramut's body has been turned into a vehicle, such as the case with Feramuts like Lifebone. But I think the sheer amount of Feramuts on Terra likely made it the ideal research location, which became more valuable as they began pursuing research into the Feramut's living arc characteristics and their ability to leverage it. But I digress. Once the precursors proved this theory that they could modify the Feramut's power, they built this massive underwater research facility to continue with their experimentation. And they called this experiment the Fosterer Project. As far as I can tell, the ultimate goal of the Fosterer Project was to modify an existing Feramut to create a living ark, and then use the power of that Feramut to create an entirely new species that was capable of resisting the Observer threat, and who would be able to carry on the Precursor's legacy and continue exploring the universe at large. So they captured a Feramut and then subjected it to a lot of experimentation and genetic modifications. One of those modifications converted the Feramut from being a land-based species to being a sea-based species. And the name of this Feramut was Isharmla. Now, the Fosterer project was abandoned when the life forms inside Isharmla were released accidentally and then escaped the Precursor's control. But while these new seaborne life forms were free to roam the oceans as they pleased, Isharmla was trapped inside the research facility and was not discovered or freed until many, many years later. Now, the more I read about the Feranmuts and the Precursor research, the more I realized just how much all of this stuff has in common with Originium. And we know that the Precursors had a bunch of different anti-observer research projects going on at the same time. The Originium and Fosterer projects were just two of many. But of all the experiments and projects the Precursors worked on, the only one that still held promise and could potentially provide a countermeasure for the observer threat was Priestess and Oracle's Originium project. Now, I'm aware that Priestess and Oracle never really talk about the Feranmuts as far as we know, and there's no real evidence that the Originium project had any connection to the Feramut research, but contextually and narratively, I think it would make a lot of sense if the Originium project was tied to the Feramut research in some way. In fact, I think it's possible that after all the failed attempts to modify an existing Feranmut into a living ark that could produce a new species that could explore space safely, the Precursors could have abandoned the modification angle and instead tried to create an artificial Feranmut. By growing a Feranmut from scratch, they could have better control over all aspects of its behavior and its development. And I think that artificial Feranmut is Originium, which I know sounds a little out there and a little crazy, very far-fetched, but just hear me out on this. Originium can bend the laws of physics to some degree, just like the Feranmuts, and it has the ability to function as an ark via its assimilated universe. You know, the place where the data from the Originium-infected individuals gets stored and preserved. And if you really think about it, these instances of preserved data of people aren't all that different from the life forms that are living inside Feranmuts. In fact, you could argue that reconveners kind of prove that life can be born from the Originium, just as it can be born from the Feranmuts. That might be what Warfarin is researching. Now, the initial plan for Originium laid out by Priestess and Oracle was to have it infect the land and slowly absorb all life into its assimilated universe, which is interesting because the genetically modified Isharmla believed that he would one day assimilate all life on Terra into himself, and then travel the stars where he would continue to assimilate all life into himself until he destroyed everything in the existing universe. Only then would he sacrifice his own body to create a brand new universe. And apparently Feramut Sui has a similar vision for the future for themselves, so this could be a trait that's inherent to many Feranmuts. And that feels like a bit of a coincidence because we've got these two Feranmuts who are talking about assimilating an entire universe into their bodies. Meanwhile, we have the assimilated universe inside of Originium. And in Isharmla's case, his little seaborne minions were gonna assimilate things for him by just eating and consuming them. And I think Oripathy might function like the seaborne, because those who are infected with Oripathy have their entire body crystallized. They are turned into Originium and then placed into the assimilated universe. Also note that the influence of Feramut power can also alter the forms of living things. Think of it as a sort of imposed evolution. And likewise, the humanoid life forms on Terra evolved into humanoid shapes because of their exposure to Originium. And if I'm right about the Originium being a sort of artificial Feranmut, and the data of the people that are inside of its assimilated universe are like the life forms inside of a living ark, and reconveners are life forms that are born of that ark, then there's really only one question we have left to answer. Who or what is the End Administrator? Now, I obviously have a hypothesis, but to explain it, we're going to need to take a little detour. When Ardashir finally decides to give us some answers this patch, albeit vague ones, he mentions a group of exiles known as the Foundation. And during this very cryptic conversation with him, Ardashir claims that he and the Administrator were once allies. But if Ardashir is aligning himself with the Foundation, then that suggests that there was a point in time when the Administrator could have been their ally as well. That could be the reason why Ardashir says, "Come back to us." Back being the operative word here. Because to come back, one has to first leave. And in order for someone to leave, they have to have been somewhere at some point. And in this case, that suggests that the End Administrator was once allied with the Foundation, and then they left. But there must have been some sort of reason why the End Administrator left. And Ardashir even says as much, and his words suggest that the Foundation may have been trying to accomplish something that the Administrator couldn't really abide by. So not only did they leave, they actively tried to fight against the Foundation. Now here's the thing. I'm pretty darn sure that this Sarkaz Cyclops girl and her overgrown bestie, that we see at the start of the game, are part of the Foundation. There's admittedly not a lot, if any, evidence for this, but context clues point in this general direction, and Ardashir's blue cross swords at the very least are very similar looking and feeling and in behavior to the magic of the Cyclops girl and her little buddy. Now this big fella is actually important because its name is Regnis, which is a German word for incident or event. But based on its enemy description, the name is likely a reference to Heidegger's work, where Regnis specifically refers to the moment in which a person assigns meaning to what they're experiencing, and that moment is what we call existence. For our purposes today, we could kind of think of this as the moment one realizes they exist, which is, in many ways, a type of birth. Which is quite interesting because Ardashir does ask the administrator to return to the place where life originated from, a place beneath the Aurora. Now this place beneath the Aurora should be the location of the Northern Stargate on Talos 2. And we've seen this location alluded to a couple of times, but most notably at the very start of the game, just before the Administrator wakes up. So the Foundation has a connection to the origin of existence and or the origin of life. And that origin of life is deeply connected to the Administrator. But you know what else is deeply connected to the origin of life? The Feranmut. This is yet another reason why I've been calling the Originium an artificial Feranmut, and why I said the Feranmut can give us some insight into who or what the Administrator is. Because see, the Administrator is a child of Originium, and they were born on Talos 2 shortly after the Terrans arrived through the Stargate. Now this should have been around the same time that Terrans seeded Talos 2 with Originium, because remember, Originium was made on Terra, not Talos. But you know what else happened around the same time? The development or discovery of Protocol Originium. And in case you forgot or didn't know, Protocol Originium is what you get when you expose Originium to ether energy. And I don't know about you, but I feel like it would make a lot of sense if the Foundation was partly responsible for studying this dangerous new ether power, since it's a power that they currently wield, at least if Ardashir and Neferth are anything to go by, and the ether side is where they currently reside. But why would the Foundation have interest or knowledge of the ether side so early into the exploration of Talos 2? Well, it's possible they'd already encountered it once on Terra. There's this extra-dimensional realm called Kargareich in the original Arknights game, which has a lot of similarities to the ether side, perhaps too many similarities, enough for them to potentially be the same thing, but by two different names. So it's quite possible that a Terran faction decided to study this realm and then continued their research on Talos 2, and that faction may have been the origin of the Foundation, which I know is highly speculative, but if I'm anywhere near close to right about this, then it is possible that the Foundation could have been responsible in part for the birth of the Administrator, because they would have been the ones to introduce ether to the Originium. And if that's the case, then it would make sense that the origin of life would be near the Stargate, because that's where the Administrator was born, the place where their life originated. And there is circumstantial evidence to back me up in Shironite, of all things, because Shironite is actually Originium that has been imbued with the power of Feranmut Sui, thanks to the abilities of the Sui proxy that's on Talos 2. And this material was developed to directly counter blight, which is a substance that leaks into real space from the ether side. But what Shironite actually does is turn blight into water. In other words, it creates real substances from unreal materials. So if you can do that with blight and an Originium derivative, then what would happen if you took an Originium seed, you know, the crystal from which all Originium on Talos 2 comes from, and then expose it to ether energy? Could you get a similar phenomenon? Could something physically manifest from the Originium as a product of its union with ether? I think it could have, and the end result was the Administrator. So if Originium is like a Feranmut, that would make the Administrator its avatar. And the birth of the Administrator was important for the Foundation. And I'm not just saying that because Ardashir keeps asking them to come back. I'm saying that because Neferth keeps calling them their savior, which means at one point in time, the Administrator could have been the savior of the Foundation. And the reason why she uses that name in a derogatory sense now is because the Administrator betrayed betrayed the Foundation. And Ardashir lends some credibility to this assumption when he says that the future of Talos 2 and Terra both depend on the Administrator. It kind of suggests that they are the salvation of humankind in some way, or at least the Originium is, and they're the executor of the Originium. But he also says that the method that Endmen has chosen to pursue in order to fulfill their role of carrying Terra and Talos into a safe future has failed over and over and over again, and with every failure, the Administrator's health gets worse, and they get weaker. M3 even says as much. But Ardashir also seems convinced that if Endmen will just accept his offer and join the Foundation and embrace the Aether, then their role can still be fulfilled, potentially at a very high cost, one that the Endmen might not be able to stomach. And all of this leads me to believe that the role of the Administrator is similar to the one the Precursors once entrusted to Isharmla. They're supposed to assimilate life, protect it, and create a new species capable of resisting the Observer threat and continuing to explore the cosmos. Or at the very least, giving the human species a new power that can counter the Observer threat. Or alternatively, they could assimilate all human life in real space, and then leave for the Aether side, where they would give birth to an entirely new universe free from the Observer's gaze. Well, hello again, and thank you for watching my very first Arknights Endfield Theory. I had a lot of fun putting this together, but the process would have been a heck of a lot harder without help from those of you who joined the story live streams and all of the folks on Discord who helped me navigate the lore from the original Arknights game. You guys deserve a round of applause because you are the best. Now, while my enablers steal the spotlight for a bit, I have a couple little patch-related thoughts that didn't really fit into this theory but are still tangentially related, so I want to share them. Now, let me start by saying I don't think Neferith is actually dead. I know Hypergriff does not like to revive their dead characters, but I think it would make sense for her specifically. Partly because Neferith's abilities remind me a lot of this character from Arknights called Nekras. Nekras basically uses these flames of life to reanimate corpses that fight for her. And her control over it got so good over time that she actually kind of died and then reanimated herself with them. And that reminds me a lot about how Neferith wields the blight with respect to the Bone Crushers. Cause see, she subjected them to a special kind of blight called Haze Fire, similar to those fires of life, right? Which strips them of their intelligence, but also allows them to fight in a way that other people in-game have described as walking corpses or zombies. And there was like this one instance where we presumably killed Rodigan, but then he somehow reappeared later, like he'd been brought back from the dead. Neferith also takes the form of a dragon at some point, despite being an Archosauria, which is not a dragon. But I would like to point out that Nekras is a Draco, which is a dragon. And you can see the influence of this in her splash art, with this big reanimated dragon in the background. And as far as evidence for Neferith to reanimate her own body, well, we shouldn't forget that Neferith carried around this little stone fetus with her for a very long time. And when she did finally let it hatch, it took on her shape, which is weird unless she has the ability to make new vessels for herself. And if she does have necromancy powers, then that would mean that she's been dead for a long time and she just makes new bodies and then reanimates them with herself. I think it's possible, and I think it would make sense. It would also make her a whole lot more threatening. Similarly, Ardashir appears to have abilities that also let him supersede death in some way. And I think he might be a kind of body hopper. Not a necromancer, but a body hopper. So it's not that he creates his own vessel, but more that he's like an incorporeal entity that like borrows or takes over existing bodies. Because he did say that he extends his own life by consuming the lives of the people he loves. So maybe he finds someone he cares about and then he becomes one with them quite literally by piloting their body. And Enfielders do comment in the quest that the Ardashir we met might not actually be his real form, and that he could be wearing a bodysuit. And Ardashir also told us that he was a Phidia, which is a snake, and snakes shed their skins. And since Ardashir also has access to like spatial manipulation magic, which is something that's typically associated with liches, I am wondering if he was originally a Phidia who is currently possessing the body of a lich. There is precedence for this sort of thing in the original Arknights game as well, in the form of the deathless black snake, who seemed to be some sort of spirit that possesses and controls people, and has done so for many, many years. And every time it changes vessels, it's kind of shedding its skin. Oh, it looks like I've run out of enablers. Okay, I think this is a good place to stop then. Allow me to thank you all once again for watching this video all the way through. I really hope you enjoyed it enough to stick around for the next one. And until that time comes, remember to take care of yourselves, drink some water, get some sleep, and I will do the same. So long, farewell, I'll see you all again.